Someone once asked you whether you thought Jesus was literally resurrected, and you said it would take me 40 hours to answer that question. The point is...
I said it would take me 40 hours to answer the question. I didn't say that he was.
How's this for an answer? Almost certainly not. What's wrong with that answer?
Between June and July 2018, Pamburn Philosophy hosted 4 live debates between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, in which Brent Weinstein moderated the first and second, and Douglas Murray participated within the third and fourth. Now, there was an enormous amount of anticipation for these conversations, as people, including myself, felt that these two men had something truly important to discuss, and that their previous 2 conversations on Sam Harris's podcast were unfortunately not very fruitful. But finally, these debates occurred, and then several months later, most of us got to see them. More on this in just a second. First, I want to explain exactly how I'm going to address these debates. Over the next month or so, I plan to create an episode for each conversation, and this video, no surprise, is dedicated to the first, which occurred in Vancouver on the 23rd of June. Now, as a quick disclaimer, know that I'm not an impartial commentator. What follows is an abridged version of the debate and my own personal analysis, and so if you haven't already, I highly recommend that you watch the full debate before watching this. This is my views on Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson's first conversation in Vancouver. Before we delve into the conversation, I want to issue an open letter to Travis Pamburn, the organiser of these events. Travis, I sincerely appreciate you facilitating these conversations, and I thoroughly enjoyed attending the one at the O2 Arena. But in the future, once such conversations have been had, please hastily release them to the public for free, with adverts, of course. The momentum coming into these debates was off a level I've never witnessed before, but by holding them behind a paywall, you halted interest considerably. If hiring big venues requires such measures, I humbly request that you cease hiring big venues, as this isn't conducive to the ongoing, important discussion that we're all a part of. Thank you. On this note, Brett christened the debate by asking the audience not to film.
To that end, we would ask that you not film tonight's discussion and broadcast it online.
But a few days later, apologised for doing so.
I feel I owe an apology to the audience for making the request I did.
As evidently, he too believes that such conversations should be accessible shortly after they've been had.
Had I known that it might be a very long time before the tapes were going to emerge, I would not have made that request.
Anyhow, let's get to the conversation already. It started off relatively slow, and consequently, so too will my review, but it picked up dramatically half an hour in. In fact, it picked up at such a pace that in order to prevent this video from being 2 hours long itself, I've had to choose which areas to focus on and which to back pocket for another time. So, Sam opened by stating that he finds 90% of what Jordan says to be very wise, insightful and useful, but the other 10% to be nonsense. And I have to say, I completely share his sentiment.
I just want to express my motive for helping to stage these events, and because I reached out to Jordan, and it really was born of seeing him in conversation with people other than myself. I saw him do a podcast with Joe Rogan. I saw him speak to Dave Rubin. I saw him speak with Brett on Rogan's podcast, and I had so much admiration for him in those conversations. So 90% of what he said in those conversations struck me as really wise and useful and well-intentioned, and 10% didn't. But I noticed that it's clear to me that seeing these successful conversations with other people who I respect, I began to wonder that I might be the problem, and I think I am the problem. Well, before you applaud, maybe I didn't mean that quite the way you took it.
Following this, Jordan opened by still manning Sam's position, which proved extremely effective, respectful, and is a courtesy I'd like to see practiced more often by all parties. Honestly, it was a solid way to start the evening.
See, one of the things that Carl Rogers said, the psychologist, was that a good way to have a discussion with someone is to tell them what you think they think until they think that what you said reflects what they said. I think that partly what's driving you, if this is accurate, is that you want to ground a structure of ethics in something solid. And there's two things you want to avoid, two catastrophes, let's say. One is the catastrophe that you identified with religious fundamentalism, and the other is the catastrophe that's associated with moral relativism. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, good. That's your first priority. And then maybe your second priority is something like, you see undue suffering in the world, plenty of it, and you would think that things would be better if that wasn't the case, and that this morality, whatever it's going to be, is at least going to ground itself in part on the presupposition that the less undue suffering in the world, the better. Is that also reasonable?
Yeah, I would just add to that the positive side of the continuum as well.
Now, as just hinted, after acknowledging Jordan's stillman, Sam then spent a few minutes to clarify his stance, and considering that Sam's position was heavily under siege within this debate, it's worth showing it now.
I'm a realist. I'm a moral realist, and what realism means is that there are right and wrong answers to questions of this kind, and you cannot know what you're missing. In fact, we almost certainly don't know what we're missing on questions of human value, and our job is to discover just how good life can be and just what variables are making it needlessly horrible, and to mitigate all of that and live in a better and better world. And I would add, to just closing the door to moral relativism here, those who do want Auschwitz are wrong to want Auschwitz.
Now, what would have been perfect at this point is if Sam similarly stillmanned Jordan's views, but the conversation naturally and understandably took a different direction. However, with this said, Jordan essentially stillmanned himself by contrasting his views against Sam's, which I'll show now, alongside clarifications he gave in a subsequent blog post.
I thought what I might do is just lay out some places that I think Sam and I agree. And because there's lots of places we agree. And then I want to figure out where we disagree, which I've been trying to sort out, and then I want to see if we can hash it out a little bit and move forward on that a bit. So I've conceptualized that slightly different than you, and that might be relevant, but I think of that as a pathology of order and a pathology of chaos. So the terminology is slightly different, but I think we're working on the same axis. I also believe that there is a catastrophe of arbitrary moral injunction, and that there's a catastrophe of moral relativism, and that has to be dealt with, and that there are genuine differences between the proper way of behaving morally and the improper way of behaving morally. And I think that they are grounded in human universals, even though there's a wide amount of variation. So that's a lot of points of agreement, right? So we know that there's two things we want to avoid, conceptually speaking, which is the moral relativism and this kind of moral absolutism that's grounded in an arbitrary statement of facts that you identify with religious fundamentalism. I would identify that with fundamentalism more generally, not with religious fundamentalism per se. You said that, for example, I still consider the world's religions to be mere intellectual ruins maintained at enormous economic and social cost, but now I understood that important psychological truths could be found in the rubble. Well, I'm trying to find the important psychological truths in the rubble. But we have to decide also if we agree about that. Like, are there important psychological truths to be found in the rubble?
Oh, absolutely.
So there's Sam and Jordan's positions. They are, as acknowledged within the conversation, actually very similar. Both men see moral relativism and religious fundamentalism to be their enemy, and both, in their different ways, have been trying to combat these adversaries. Jordan by attempting to salvage the rubble of Christianity and religion in general, and Sam by using new stone that's comprised of reason, rationality, science, and logic. From here, the following 10 minutes of the conversation, believe it or not, can be summed up as Jordan conveying, in several ways, why he thinks the problem with religious fundamentalism is that it's fundamental, or dogmatic, rather than that it's religious, and then Sam conveying, in several ways, that he agrees. Here's the first wave.
We know that there's two things we want to avoid, conceptually speaking, which is the moral relativism and this kind of moral absolutism that's grounded in an arbitrary statement of facts that you identify with religious fundamentalism. I would identify that with fundamentalism more generally, not with religious fundamentalism per se, because I see it also happening in secular states, let's say, like Nazi Germany or so it doesn't seem to be religious fundamentalism per se that's crucial to your argument.
No, it's not. So that just to close the loop on that, the only reason why I would focus on religion in particular there is that religion is the only language game wherein fundamentalism and dogmatism, dogmatism is not a pejorative concept. Dogma is a good word, specifically within Catholicism, and the notion that you must believe things on faith, that is in the absence of compelling evidence that would otherwise cause a rational person to believe it, that in a religious context is considered a feature, not a bug. Elsewhere we recognize it to be a bug.
Now, I personally think that Sam's point here is of critical importance and that it perfectly represents why religion is a synonym of dogma. To quote Matt Dillahunty, beliefs inform actions and actions have consequences, and so when someone's convinced that the creator of the universe has communicated with them via telepathy or scripture, it's easy to understand why they tend to regard their beliefs to be absolutely 100% infallible. Anyhow, Jordan's second way of making this point was by giving examples of dogmas that he deems not religious, such as the USSR and Nazi Germany. And Sam replied by agreeing, but making clear that Nazi Germany was religious and that atheism had nothing to do with the atrocities of the USSR, contrary to what Jordan has claimed in the past.
Right, but what I'm curious about specifically is, because it seems to me that the dogmas of the USSR and the dogmas of Nazi Germany were as pernicious as any religious dogmas, and they may also share important features with pernicious religious dogmas, but it isn't clear to me from your perspective what those commonalities would be.
Well, so, I mean, in some ways you're recapitulating an argument I've made, and this is an argument that I would make against you were you to claim, as you have elsewhere, that atheism is responsible for the greatest atrocities of the 20th century. The idea that Stalinism and Nazism and fascism were expressions of atheism simply doesn't make any sense. I mean, in the case of fascism and Nazism, it doesn't make any sense because the fascists and the Nazis, by and large, were not even atheists. I mean, Hitler wasn't an atheist, and he was talking about executing a divine plan, and he got lots of support from the churches, and the Vatican did nothing to stop him, and fascism, as you know, coexisted quite happily with Catholicism in Croatia and Portugal and Spain and Italy. So, but even in the case of Stalin, what was so wrong with that situation were all of the ways in which it so resembled a religion. You had a personality cult, you had dogmatism that held sway to a point where apostasy and blasphemy were killing offenses. You know, the people who didn't toe the line were eradicated, and you know, so to take a more modern example, North Korea is a religious cult. It just doesn't happen to be a one that is focused on the next life or you know, supernatural claims of,
so what
of
would
magic.
Be
the problem is dogmatism. The overarching problem is believing things strongly on bad evidence. And and the reason why dogmatism is so dangerous is that it doesn't allow us to revise our bad ideas in real time through conversation.
Now, as previously said, this point was reiterated multiple times, but I'll just show one more, this time from Brett.
The reason to fear religious dogma is really on the dogma side and not the religion side, which at least leaves open the possibility that something could exist over on the religion side that doesn't have that characteristic, right? That often they travel in tandem, but that the thing to fear is not the religious belief, it is the dogmatic nature of the way it is conveyed.
Oh, yeah.
Is that fair?
The other way to say that is the only thing that's wrong with religion is the dogmatism. If you get rid of I've got no problem with the buildings and the music and the paintings and, you know.
Wait a minute. That's not a trivial point, and it's not just a joke, because the buildings and the music are very important parts of the religious process. And so I know there's a humorous element to that, but it's not like Sam is throwing out the baby with the bathwater there.
Finally, with this settled, Jordan proceeded to explain that tribal violence is also not inherent to religion, and again, Sam agreed, but he also explained why the two are so associated.
One of the things that was really shocking to me, I would say, was my reading of what was originally Jane Goodall's discovery about chimp behavior, you know, because there was this idea that was really rooted in Rousseauian thinking that the reason that people committed atrocities in the service of their group identity, let's say their tribal identity, was because culture had corrupted us. So it was a uniquely human thing. But then, of course, Goodall showed in the 1970s that the chimps at Gombe, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, would go on raiding parties, right? And so there'd be like 4 or 5 adolescent chimps, usually male, sometimes with a female in there. They would patrol the borders of their territory. If they found an interloper on the border, near the border, from another troop, even if it was a member of their troop that had emigrated, so to speak, and that they had some history with, they would tear them to pieces. The fact that chimps do it shows that it can't be a consequence of something like religious belief, unless you're willing to say that the reason that chimps commit atrocity in the service of their troop and their territory is because chimps are religious.
Obviously, the problem of primate aggression, which we've inherited along with the chimps, is deeper, or at least different, than the problem of religious violence or totalitarian political structures that get the worst out of people. So, we have these primate capacities that we have to correct for, and we're busily trying to correct for almost everything that we've been evolved to do. We don't like the state of nature for good reason, and virtually everything that's good about human life is born of our, I would argue, culture-based and highly intelligent and necessary effort to mitigate what is in fact natural for us. And there's nothing more natural than tribal violence. It's not unique to religion. It's also nationalism, and it's racism, and it's all other kinds of dogmatism. But what most worries me are those cases where clearly good people who are not necessarily captured by tribalism per se, are doing the unthinkable based purely on religious doctrines that they believe wholeheartedly without good evidence.
There's this great quote from Steven Weinberg, that being, with or without religion, you would have good people doing good things and bad people doing bad things. But if you want a good person to do a bad thing, that takes religion. And I think that's pretty much what Sam was conveying here. It's an imperfect but very important point, and it can't just be hand-waved away. All of us unfortunately know an otherwise wonderful person who, because of religion, dislikes homosexuals, don't we? Moving on, the next phase of the conversation pivoted on interpretation of scripture, and this was where true disagreement emerged and where I'll get a bit more involved. It began with Jordan replying to Sam's previous point by saying that what it comes down to is interpretation, and that this is a really big problem because fundamentalists not only claim that their scripture is infallible, but that so too is their interpretation of their scripture, which is a brilliant point.
And so the fundamentalist claim is far worse. It's that not only is there an absolute reality, truth, embedded in the book, but that their particular take on that absolute reality is the absolute take on that book. And so they conflate their own. They make an assumption of their own omniscience and then pass that off onto God.
And Sam responded, true to form, with what I think is an exceptional point, and that is that some scripture, such as verses that prescribe rules and regulations, are very hard to interpret other than as literal, since they are by their very nature instructions to be followed.
Except in their defense, and I don't often rise to the defense of fundamentalists, it's very easy to get there because some of the claims in the book are not at all hard to parse. In fact, many of them can only be honestly interpreted one way. So to take, again, an example that will be not inflammatory to you, but makes the point, it just says that the remedy for theft in the Quran is to cut the hands off a thief. I mean, that is the unambiguous injunction. It's not an allegory. Mm-hmm. It's not. You have to indulge some kind of tortured interpretive scheme to avoid the shocking fact that the creator of the universe thinks you should live this way. Slavery is condoned in the Bible, in both Testaments, and in the Quran. There's no getting away from that. Now you can say, well, it's not the central thrust of any of these books. But if you go to the books and try to figure out what the creator of the universe wants with respect to the owning and needless immiseration of other people, right? He expects you to keep slaves, and he's told you how to do it. Don't knock out their eyes and their teeth. If you're a Muslim, don't take other Muslims as slaves. But it's not an accident that the people who joined ISIS thought that it was absolutely kosher to take slaves.
Okay, so I'm going to bolster this point in just a minute, but first, here's Brett's objection to it.
So Sam, you said the problem here is that the dogma can't be updated, right? That slavery is with us permanently because it's written into the dogma. But clearly, most of the traditions in which it's written into the holy book don't practice slavery, and the people who adhere to these belief systems wouldn't defend slavery. So clearly there is the capacity for an update mechanism.
Well, no, but not really. I mean, they've been forced, they've had it beaten out of them, right? I mean, we fought a civil war in the U.S. to get rid of slavery.
But it was Christians who abolished slavery in England, though.
What was that?
It was Christians who were at the forefront of the movement to abolish slavery in England.
There are Christians on either side of everything. I mean, there's no one else to do the job.
Right, but that's the update mechanism.
Wait a second. But it was specifically Christians who were using their Christian belief as a justification for eradicating slavery.
The problem was they were actually on the losing side of a theological argument. And it would be much better, I think you would agree, if one of the 10 commandments had been, don't keep slaves. I mean, there's certainly one we could swap out for that one. And so that way, it would have been much easier for Christians to have fought against slavery. And it's much harder for Muslims, frankly, to fight against it now. The problem is that there's a point I made, I think, in my first book, is that the doors leading out of this kind of fundamentalism don't open from the inside. They get bashed open from the outside. And it's humanism and it's secularism and it's scientific rationality that has exerted such pressure, such winnowing pressure on Christianity, now for multiple centuries, that's why we're not encountering the Christians of the 14th century on a daily basis.
Now, I find this point to be resounding. Just imagine if the Holy Book said, "Thou shalt not own other people," instead of, "Whoever doeth any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death." Or even, "Don't rape other people," instead of, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images." Huh? Or at the very least, imagine if the Holy Books didn't include clear instructions detailing who you can enslave and what you're permitted to do to them. Anyhow, from here, Brett switched his attention to Jordan and asked the following.
Would you agree that there are things written into these religious texts that are unambiguously unacceptable viewed through a modern lens, and not because the texts are so complicated that we have misunderstood something, but there are things that are just written in there that we now understand to be wrong?
And this is where, in my opinion, Jordan's house of cards began to fall, and I'll explain why in just a moment. For now, enjoy the next 4 minutes.
The first thing I would say is that we have to be very careful about equating all the religious texts. And I do actually think that you are careful about that. But that's something we can have a discussion about a little bit later.
I agree with you there.
So because, for a lot of my life, I would say, more interested in the universal truths expressed in religious belief across different cultures. But I've become more and more aware of the important distinctions between the religious cultures maybe in the last 10 years. So it isn't clear to me that you can just throw all religious dicta in the same bucket. And there's complex reasons for that. So, and one question, which you kind of sent at Sam already, is, do you see a hierarchy of unacceptability between different religious doctrines? I mean, and I would say you acted, okay, fine. So, okay, now, but here's an interesting issue. And I think we're starting to zero in on, we've covered what we agree on, a lot of it. But there's another thing.
Answer Brett's question, because I think it was a good one.
Sorry, I answered the first half of it, but the second part is, I think that this is where I'm going to sound like a postmodernist, which I really hate. I would say, sentence by sentence, yes, you're correct. Paragraph by paragraph, perhaps. But here's the problem with complicated texts, especially ones that actually constitute narratives. So imagine this. So imagine you're at a movie, and it's a movie with a twist at the end. And so the entire movie is set up to make you think one particular way and to have one set of experiences. But when you put the twist in at the end, it changes the entire structure. And so this is one of the complex problems that actually led to the rise of postmodern interpretations of literature, which is that if you take a complex narrative, there's a very large number of ways of interpreting it, and it isn't self-evident which of those are canonically correct. And we can deal with that horrible issue later, but it's a good objection, and it's true. And what it does is it makes these sorts of things quite complicated, because in the Bible is a series of books, and they had influence on one another, and they were sequenced with a very complex editorial process, and there's actually a developmental narrative that links all the chapters together. And what that means, this is at least, I'm going to speak from the perspective, or in terms of analysis of the Christian Bible, what it means is that you have to read the beginning as if it's also influenced by the end, which is what, by the way, and in case you think that I'm weaseling around here, and I'm not, is that's exactly what you do every time you read any story, any work of fiction. You say, well, you're not claiming that the Bible is a work of fiction. It's like, that's just a cheap objection. That's not my point. My point is that it's a narrative. And everything in a narrative is conditioned by all the rest of the things in the narrative. And it's well known, like if you're a screenwriter, for example, there's an old dictum, I don't remember who generated it, was one of the great Russians, that if there's a rifle lying on a table in the first scene, that it better be used by the end of the second scene, or it shouldn't have been there at all. So there's this coherence.
I'm looking for the rifle in your answer to this question, though, because I want it to be used.
Indeed, where's the rifle? Sure, Jordan admitted that sentence by sentence some scripture is unacceptable, but he immediately negated this admission by subsequently saying,
the Bible is a series of books, and they had influence on one another, and they were sequenced with a very complex editorial process, and there's actually a developmental narrative that links all the chapters together. And what that means is that you have to read the beginning as if it's also influenced by the end.
Now, many of Jordan's fans will insist that I'm just missing his point here, perhaps even deliberately, but I'm not. He is weaseling. This is an example of the 10%, ladies and gentlemen. I completely understand and accept that fiction tends to be written with a narrative in mind, and that narrative can, and often does, dramatically change the way in which we experience a story. But here's the thing, the holy books are not movies. They don't claim to be fiction. When Leviticus states, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall surely be put to death. This isn't a story, and it's not an allegory. It's a divine demand. It's a prescription supposedly authored by the creator of everything. Now, I could go on, but there's a lot more to cover.
My point is that it isn't reasonable to take a single sentence out of a coherent narrative and say that stands on its own, or it's rarely reasonable, because you have to interpret the word in the sentence and the sentence in the paragraph and the paragraph in the chapter and the chapter in the context of the entire book. You have to do that. Now, you could object, and reasonably so, that there are some sentences that are so blatant that you can't use context to paraphrase them, let's say. But I think you also have to give the devil its due. The Christian Bible is a developmental narrative, and the beginning has to be read in light of the end. And is it a fact?
Okay, well,
so what does that do to Moses' laws of war? This is not a narrative. This is instructions about what to do when you invade a foreign land. If you intend to take over that land, you kill everybody. Right? There are other rules in there about killing husbands and taking the wives for yourself.
Yeah, the Old Testament's a brutal document.
Absolutely brutal. And so my point would be, I don't know that reading that portion in light of the end, even if you call the end the New Testament, I don't know that it changes Moses' laws of war and their acceptability in any modern
hypothetically, if you
context.
take the New Testament seriously, it does, because it's a document that supersedes it. And I think there's actually technical reasons why it
doesn't
supersedes
supersede it on every point. I mean, this is the problem. Slavery is a very straightforward case, because clearly the Bible thumpers of the South who were defending slavery with reference to the text felt they were on firm ground. And I would invite anyone to read what the New Testament and the Old Testament say about slavery to see that they were on fairly firm ground, that the balance of the honest reading was on the side of clearly we can keep slaves, right? Jesus never envisioned a world without slavery, and he admonished slaves to serve their masters well and to serve their Christian masters especially well.
The English Protestants wouldn't have agreed with that because, like I said, they were at the forefront of the fight against slavery.
Okay, but
I think
they
was
were clearly influenced by something outside the text, and this is, again, you're making this harder than it is, and my concern is why. Right?
Well, I don't think I am, Sam, because I think that the fundamental message in the New Testament, for example, is that
so then you acknowledge that the Old Testament, so Jews are in possession of a book that has some diabolical passages that would be better left out.
Again, how is this not weaseling? Why doesn't Jordan simply say, yes, the verses that command us to keep slaves and execute homosexuals, apostates and blasphemers are unacceptable, but this doesn't mean that everything in the book is unacceptable or unwise? That would be a perfectly good answer because it wouldn't forfeit any of the valuable archetypes that Jordan sees in the Bible. But for some reason, he just wouldn't sincerely say this. And this brings me to a question that I'd like to ask you, the viewer. When Sam said,
you're making this harder than it is, and my concern is why?
What are your thoughts? Is Jordan making this harder than what it is? Anyhow, this video is getting very long now, and I'll put that down to teething problems my end. And so what I'm going to do is fast forward to the primary remaining points of contention, starting with Jordan criticising Sam's moral landscape, and then Sam criticising Jordan's God. So here's Jordan challenging Sam.
You tell two stories. You tell a story about someone who has an absolutely terrible life. They're in a jungle where nature is trying to kill them all the time. And while they're trying to be killed by nature, while nature is trying to kill them all the time, horrible barbaric thugs are making their life miserable in every possible way. Okay, so that's one pole, let's say. And then another pole, you identify, and these are hypotheticals, so I guess they're fictions. That's one way of thinking about it, even though they're extracted from real situations. They're meta-fictions, they're meta-truths, that's another way of thinking about it. You contrast a good life, and that's a life where the person has enough to eat and enough shelter, and they have the things that you would expect people to want. You say, this is a bad life, and you say, this is a good life. And then you say and then you make a side move, which I would say is that's an objectively verifiable fact. I would say, I don't think it is an objectively verifiable fact. I think it's a fundamental moral claim. And I think that's where you put your stake in the ground. And I would say, when I read that, I thought, well, if you take your jungle story, which you've extracted from a bunch of horrors and compiled, and you take your positive story, which you've extracted from a bunch of horrors, or a bunch of quasi-utopias, let's say, and compiled, you're 2/3 of the way to a landscape of hell and heaven.
Right.
Well, so then why not continue the abstraction and say, look, what we're really trying to avoid here is hell.
Oh, yeah.
What we're really trying to move towards is heaven. Yeah, but as soon as you do that, you're in a religious landscape.
No, but my name for hell is... It's very interesting because, you and I were talking about this at dinner. We were talking about this at dinner and how the overlap or lack of overlap between our audiences. And so, I just heard from your audience there. And
you might have heard from the odd convert.
But what's amazing to me is, I have to do some work to figure out what point they think you made. Because...
Wait a second. Wait, no.
Hold on.
No. I said, if you're going to produce a fiction, why not go right to the end?
Okay,
because you did produce a fiction. Tell me why I'm wrong, because I'm really trying to understand it. See, I think you dealt with G.E. Moore's problem of infinite regress by staking a moral proposition. And your moral proposition was, look, here's a way things can be horrible, and here's a way things can be good. Can we accept that this is horrible and this is good, and that we should move towards good? And if the answer is yes, we can accept that, then we can proceed. And maybe we can even proceed with extracting values from facts, but we have to accept that a priori presupposition first. And you insist that we have to accept it because it's objectively true. And I don't think that's correct, because you say, this is horrible, this is good. We should move from what's horrible to what's good. Say, yes, you've taken a fragment of the universal story and you've made it the axiom of your moral system, which is what you should do. But the claim that I think is not helpful, even though I understand it, is that that's purely a claim of unmediated fact. It's like, no, there is no unmediated fact.
There is, yes. Even facts aren't unmediated facts. I mean, you can't judge something to be factual without presupposing the validity of certain intuitions, like that causes precede events. Or causes precede their effects. But again, you do pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that there's no branch of science or mathematics or anything fundamental, logic, that can get away from that.
Right. Well, and that's another place.
But given that picture, that doesn't render all intuitions equally respectable.
Now, I personally believe Jordan did a pretty damn good job here of expressing the concerns that many people have with Sam's moral landscape, and that he is indeed right when he says that wanting to avoid suffering, or hell, is an unmediated fact. And I don't want to get too bogged down in epistemology here. When Sam said,
you can't judge something to be factual without presupposing the validity of certain intuitions, like that causes precede events, or causes precede their effects.
He nailed it. People don't tend to realise this because it's deeply intuitive, but we all ignore G.E. Moore's infinite regress because we don't actually have justification for using reason, evidence, logic, or intuition without appealing to reason, evidence, logic, or intuition. You see, we can keep asking why, and when we do, we find that it really is turtles all the way down. However, we don't keep asking why when it comes to facts about physics and, say, biology, but most people do keep asking why when it comes to morality, and Sam sees this as a kind of backward special pleading fallacy, and so too do I. I've created a recent video dedicated to morality in which I further explain this, and so I won't delve too much into it here, but please check it out if you want to know more. And so, let's move on to Jordan's definition of God. What follows is Jordan putting it surprisingly succinctly, and so I'll see you in 3 hours.
God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time, as the most real aspects of existence manifest themselves across the longest of time frames, but are not necessarily apprehensible as objects in the here and now. So what that means in some sense is that you have conceptions of reality built into your biological and metaphysical structure that are a consequence of processes of evolution that occurred over unbelievably vast expanses of time, and that structure your perception of reality in ways that it wouldn't be structured if you only lived for the amount of time that you're going to live. And that's also part of the problem of deriving values from facts, because you're evanescent and you can't derive the right values from the facts that portray themselves to you in your lifespan, which is why you have a biological structure that's like 3.5 billion years old. So God is that which eternally dies and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being and truth. That's a fundamental element of hero mythology. God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. That's another way of looking at it. God is what calls and what responds in the eternal call to adventure. God is the voice of conscience. God is the source of judgment and mercy and guilt. God is the future to which we make sacrifices and something akin to the transcendental repository of reputation. Here's a cool one if you're an evolutionary biologist. God is that which selects among men in the eternal hierarchy of men. So, men arrange themselves into hierarchies, and then men rise in the hierarchy. And there's principles that are important that determine the probability of their rise, and those principles aren't tyrannical power. They're something like the ability to articulate truth and the ability to be competent and the ability to make appropriate moral judgments. And if you can do that in a given situation, then all the other men will vote you up the hierarchy, so to speak, and that will radically increase your reproductive fitness. And the operation of that process across long expanses of time looks to me like it's codified in something like the notion of God the Father. It's also the same thing that makes men attractive to women. because women peel off the top of the male hierarchy, and the question is what should be at the top of the hierarchy, and the answer right now is tyranny as part of the patriarchy, but the real answer is something more like the ability to use truthful speech in the service of, let's say, well-being. And so that's something that operates across tremendous expanses of time, and it plays a role in the selection for survival itself, which makes it a fundamental reality.
Jordan, can I just cut in here with one question?
I'll stop with that for now.
And people wonder why I compare Jordan to Deepak Chopra. Huh?
God is the mystery of our origin, and therefore God is our highest instinct.
God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values.
We are a drop in the ocean of consciousness that we call God.
God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time.
Divine intelligence that permeates every aspect of the cosmos, the whole universe.
God is that which eternally dies and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being and truth.
In response to Jordan's definition, Sam gave several decisive criticisms, but I'm just going to focus on a few of them here. Now, as a side note, I plan to dedicate an entire video to Jordan's definition of God, and so here I'll be a little more terse. So Sam's main objections was that Jordan's God is significantly different to conventional definitions.
I'm not hearing a God, a personal God who can possibly hear anyone's prayers, much less answer them.
That he's playing a similar game to New Agers who redefine God to mean energy.
By shifting the definition, you have robbed the noun, the traditional noun, of its traditional meaning.
And that anyone could play this game with any nonsense and yet seem sophisticated.
You could do the same thing with the idea of ghosts, right? So people traditionally have believed in ghosts. It's an archetype, you might say, the ghost. Survival of death is certainly an archetype. And we know what most people most of the time mean when they say they believe in ghosts. And I say, I don't believe in ghosts. And you say, no, you do believe in ghosts. Ghosts are your relationship to the unseen. That's a ghost. So you have a new definition of ghost that you're putting in the place provided, which I have to say, well, of course I have a relationship to the unseen, so yeah, I guess I do believe in ghosts. You know, you win that argument. But that simply isn't what most people mean by a ghost.
Again, Sam said much more, but I'll show that another time. Now, Jordan replied, well, I'll play it and then comment.
Hey, wait a second, people.
I'm not so
what
sure
do you mean by
this.
traditional meaning? Look, it's one of the elemental claims in the Old Testament is that you're not even supposed to utter the name of God, because by defining it too tightly, you lose its essence. And so let's not be talking about what the classical definition of God is here, okay? It's a historical non-starter.
Sure, many religions have, and still do, forbid their congregation from uttering their God's name or depicting their God's form. But none, of at least the major religions, forbid their congregation from understanding their God. In fact, they do the opposite. They encourage their flock to understand their central structures, including their gods, if they have them. And that really is the same thing as defining their God. To understand something, you must have a coherent definition. Or to put this another way, I think Jordan made a good point here, but that he didn't actually address the criticism. He bypassed it.
Look, I've never made the claim that what I'm talking about is like what other people are talking about. I mean, it is in some ways, but I've not made that claim, so I don't see why that's a justifiable criticism.
Now, to be fair, so far as I'm aware, Jordan's correct here. I don't think he's ever actually claimed that he's speaking about the same God that most people have in mind. But because he calls himself a Christian, and because 99% of Christians believe that God is a literal being that created the entire universe, that Jesus was literally the Son of God, and that Jesus literally resurrected, for Jordan not to make crystal clear that his Christianity is radically different to any of the conventional denominations is indeed a problem. It's not wrong, but again, it's problematic, and in my opinion, it's akin to what Deepak Chopra does with New Age woo-woo. And incidentally, that's exactly the point Sam made.
Deepak clearly wants to let his audience believe that everything they're into is on some level justifiable by his reading of quantum spookiness, right?
Yeah.
So it's all if you want to go out and just buy a lot of crystals and think they're going to heal you, it has something to do with the quantum nature of reality.
Absolutely nothing like me.
No.
God is the mystery of our origin, and therefore God is our highest instinct.
God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values.
I think Deepak could say, if I got his back to the wall, Deepak could honestly say, listen, I've never said anything about crystals, right? I'm not selling crystals. I've never said they work, but it's the way in which he's failing to make the clear differentiation.
This, for me, nails it. There's nothing technically wrong with Jordan's definition of words such as God, religion, truth, real, Jesus, Christianity, atheist, or you. But the way in which he's using them is, at least seemingly, insidious and evasive. Despite Jordan's protestations to the contrary, Sam's ghost analogy is spot on. Anyhow, before wrapping up, I couldn't do so without showing my personal favourite exchange of the night, and it was this.
Someone once asked you whether you thought Jesus was literally resurrected, and you said it would take me 40 hours to answer that question. Okay, that's the kind of thing I'm responding to here. You don't need to do that if you have a clear-cut answer to that question.
I don't have a clear-cut answer to that question.
And if you don't, that connects with many other things that we still have to talk about. Let's put it probabilistically. I mean, anything's possible. I'll tell you that it's possible that he was physically resurrected. I mean, it's even possible.
But wait a second, I didn't
with respect
say
to quantum
that he
mechanics.
was.
The point is,
I said it would take me 40 hours to answer the question. I didn't say that he was.
Okay, how's this for an answer? Almost certainly not. What's wrong with that answer?
And with that bombshell, I'll conclude. Overall, I found this debate to be very productive. Sure, it started slow, but when it finally ignited, it did so dramatically. A lot of ground was covered, and many huge fires were extinguished, but it also left many still raging, which was fine, of course, because there were still 3 conversations to be had. It would have been nice, however, to have listened to this conversation and the one that followed before attending the third at the O2, but I've already made this point. Anyhow, I'm Steve, or Rationality Rules, and as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have donated via PayPal. And I'll leave you with just one more of my favourite parts of the debate.
If you're in a parish of 1, or in a parish of 1,000, or a parish of 100,000, but not in the parish that has anything in common with the Bible thumpers in my country who think that Jesus is very likely coming back in their lifetime because he never died, and he's going to judge the living and the dead, and there will be a resurrection and hellfire and all the rest. If that's not the game you're playing at all, own it.